I am Judith Ann Moseman. My maiden name was Van Wambach, with a space between the Van and the Wambach. What brought me to Bethel was, in some ways, my grandparents. I knew nothing of Bethel. I knew no one from Bethel. Did not know the BGC, but my grandparents received this Swedish language newspaper from which they found out about Bethel because there were ads in the newspaper from time to time, Bethel being so Swedish oriented. So they told me about it, and we were intrigued because I wanted to go a little bit more distance from home than Wheaton would have allowed for, or even Taylor. So this sounded good to me. And because I was working full-time to save money for college, my parents and my siblings checked it out and decided it would, in fact, be a good place for me. And so I began here in 1961, graduated in 65, and with a degree in elementary education, and our class was the first to leave Bethel with that. So from there, I began teaching. When I came back, that was a different story, so I can list some of those things for you. When I came back in 1970 and 1971, Junit Runback had asked me to come and help her both spring semesters to help supervise student teachers. And I will speak more of her because she was an amazing mentor for me. But that was spring semesters of those 2 years. In 78, Bethel hired me to teach just one course, but for 2 semesters, because a faculty member had passed away and they were seeking to fill that gap and that her load. At that time, I was teaching 3/4 time at the College of St. Catherine, so Bethel had called to ask the dean there if they could borrow me. So that was a year where I taught pretty much between the 2 institutions, taught full-time. In 1981, Bethel hired me then to come and to join the education department here, where I was full-time and taught several courses and supervised student teachers. In 1985, I became the director of alumni and parent services, followed 7 former alumni directors, all of whom had been male. In 1987, I became the vice president for student life and the dean of students. I was the first female vice president and became a member of President Brushaber's PAC, which was the President's Administrative Advisory Council, PAAC. My areas of responsibility as the vice president were student development, residence life, health service, counseling, career planning and placement, multicultural development, and athletics. In 2007, I retired from that position, but continued unofficially on a few committees that I had served on. And then Jay Barnes asked me if I would serve as the director of the National Prayer Initiative, again, which kept me connected to Bethel over 12 more years while he served as president, and was really a privilege to connect people who had a heart to pray for Bethel, to connect them with the needs and the praises that we had on campus over that time. And I still am blessed to continue on the President's Prayer Council at the invitation of President Allen. Well, when I first started as a student, Bethel was just very much what I'd hoped for. I found it to be a strong Christian atmosphere and with sufficient academic challenge. I'd had a really, I think, excellent high school education. President Carl Lundquist was a pietist with the accompanying irenic spirit and a man of deep prayer. And I've told his daughters how much I appreciated hearing him pray. It just seemed like when he would pray audibly, we were just hearing a part of an ongoing conversation that he had with the Lord. But the campus was good. The lifestyle was similar to what I'd been accustomed to in my independent Bible church upbringing. I really enjoyed campus life, and I had a chance at my few first leadership positions while I was a student here. When I returned in the 80s, Bethel was dealing with growing pains. So much was good and maturing and advancing, yet much needed to be added and endorsed as Bethel was clarifying its niche, I think, both among the colleges in Minnesota and also in the larger group of Christian colleges. I was so thankful to be back in a setting again where my faith could be fully woven into my teaching and where there was fellowship and nurturing of my faith. Bethel was coming into its own, and during that decade, my first decade here, strategic planning and employee surveys and things like that were initiated. And when I was catapulted into the VP role in 1987, there was a strategic initiative for the whole campus, but especially one goal was to revitalize student life, and thus the addition of the VP position at that level of administration. Women that impacted me. I realized that the women that impacted and mentored me more were sometimes during my student time here and carried over into my later time. Ma Chris was my house mother, and that was what they did back then for dormitories on campus, many campuses. She was elderly at the time, but she was a role model and support for me as I entered into my first attempts at leadership. I was elected the president of the dorm as a sophomore, and then I served as an RA in my junior and senior years. And during that time, she gave me a lot of help and affirmation about my leadership. And she saw her own position as a calling, and she did it with such confidence and love. And she also prayed for me for years after, and she told me she never dared quit. Effie Nelson was the Dean of Women when I was at the college, and when I was at the college. She also taught German. She was a tough disciplinarian, but she had a soft heart. I remembered her when I started working in student life later, remembered her as a role model. She had me in her office a few times when I was a freshman for what I'm sure were minor infractions. But she made it clear then that she expected more of me and that she was sure she would never again have to deal with my being, quote unquote, campused, which was one of the consequences of being caught in the halls after hours, etc. Things, Ellie, that you would not have ever even thought about. But she said she didn't think she'd ever have to deal with me again, and that made me quite sure I didn't want to be either. Marilyn Starr became an adult friend even as she was a professor in physical education here. She became concerned about my health for a while and was inquiring carefully, tenderly. That was a role model for me of how she could care for a student. I also noted that she continued her education and ultimately became a dean from her job in physical education. She brought a lot of energy and good-spiritedness to her work. Flossie Winquist was the director of the health service for many years. She worked with several doctors, and I was privileged to have her care for me when I was a student and ended up in the infirmary. And then I became her boss when I was the VP, and that just delighted both of us. She was gentle but no nonsense, had an upbeat personality, a wonderful sense of humor, but she was so good at encouraging students and giving them hope. And that's something that I drew from her both when I was a student and a colleague. Probably the most important of my mentors who I would say bridged the gap for me between being a student and being a professional was Dr. Judy Moseman, who was the founder of Bethel's elementary education department. She was a mentor for me then, and she continued to stay in touch with me after my graduation, placing several student teachers with me. She was very significant as that bridge, as I mentioned. When I resigned from teaching after 4 years to have our first child, Judy Moseman contacted me and made me an amazing offer. She said, would I consider working with her during spring semester to help her supervise the student teachers? The department was growing and there were too many for her to manage on her own. I was really stunned, even though I was also interested, because I had assumed that now I would stay home and be a mom. Once agreed upon that I would do this with her, she met with me weekly over the course of the fall and winter prior to my starting, and she invited me to bring my baby along and have it sleep in her office while we met. It was an amazing kind of thing to support me that way. And she basically required me to read textbooks, discuss them with her, review situations, what that student's supervision would require of me. And it was basically a master's course in clinical supervision, I should say, where I learned to be critical too, I guess, but a master's course in clinical supervision. When it began that spring, it was the spring of 1970, she and I took the same students in alternate weeks. That way it ensured that she knew how everyone was doing, but she also knew how I was doing. And I did have evidently earned her trust, because the next spring she gave me students to supervise on my own. I had utmost admiration for her. I saw her working sacrificial numbers of hours with the lights turned on at the education house on the old campus as she developed that entire program before it was accredited. I admired her for her ability to provide very direct and specific correction and also affirmation. She told me when I was a student, she told me point blank that I had some serious gifts and I could do a lot of things by just sliding through, but don't. She told me to always be well prepared, to give my best to my work and to my life. She did, however, look a bit shocked when she hired me to supervise in '71 for the second spring semester, and I had had another baby. "Is that all you're going to do with your life?" she asked me. As the education program grew, Bethel hired a full-time professor to work alongside of Dr. Runbeck, so I was no longer needed. However, again, she advanced me. She mentored me by giving my name to the College of St. Catherine when she learned of a position that was open in their education department. I subsequently taught there for 10 years while working on my master's degree and beginning my doctorate. In later years, as I was promoted to the positions I held at Bethel, Dr. Runbeck was so kind and so pleased for me, which was like solid gold coming from her, and I owed her so much. Yes, it was difficult. One question that's part of that was gaps in policies and things like that. Because when I began full-time, our children were 5, 10, and 12 ages. So I didn't have to worry about maternity leave or pregnancy policies or anything like that. But I fully supported them because I realized there was a need for such policies for others. But yes, you ask if it was difficult. Being a woman at Bethel was difficult sometimes and in some ways at that time. And for me, the pressures and challenges, particularly of the VP position, were very real. I disappointed myself and others at times. How often I prayed for patience and endurance, and especially for wisdom, and how often I was helped beyond what I could have imagined. Very helpful perspective for me during the challenges came from 2 Corinthians 4, verse 1. It's only by God's grace and mercy that I have this ministry. Therefore, I will not lose heart. In the education department, I felt respected as a woman, and also when I was the alumni director. However, since I was responsible to provide programming for both the college and the seminary alumni, I was a surprise to some, especially in the seminary group. For instance, at one seminary homecoming event, a dear old pastor asked me afterwards what it was that my husband did at Bethel so that I got to help out like that from time to time. I'm sure he was not the only one who wondered, again, since the 7 alumni directors who preceded me had all been male. But comments like that just needed to be quickly and easily forgiven, because I realized how new it was to have women in roles where men had always served before. I felt mostly support from faculty as I was the new VP. Possibly I was advantaged by having so recently been one of them. Faculty served on committees with us and for us that required them to work well with student life. Although they didn't always agree with us, many stayed in the conversations as we worked out policies, or they dealt with student disciplinary appeals. They served as faculty reps to the MIAC athletic conference. I chose some who joined us on search committees that I hired coaches or hired our professional staff. And those of us in student life served alongside them, teaching freshman seminar leadership courses, working on institutional accreditations, BARC, the Bethel Anti-Racism and Reconciliation Commission, things like that. So it seemed that the expectations of me by faculty were mostly positive. There were, of course, some colleagues on staff or faculty or administration who doubted my ability and my right to be the VP. That seemed to be mostly in the first year or so, but I'm sure there were doubters in other seasons for other reasons. I learned that no matter what I did, someone would probably not like it. I faced sometimes hurtful comments from students and employees, including comments like how intimidating I was, or I made a terrible decision to hire that person, or one I didn't know quite what to do with. You're such a mother for all our students, just didn't seem to weigh the importance of the position at all. And there were those who expected me to be easy on them, or that I would be easy to fall. In a disciplinary appeal meeting, a couple of students said to me, "Oh, come on, Mose. What would it take to just make this go away?" While others, I think, were quite sure that I was too soft on some issues. Couldn't make everybody happy. In a budget meeting with male administrators, a colleague questioned my ability to understand budgets. My disappointment was that no one else challenged him. They just seemed surprised. I assured him that I had done budgets before. I also had wonderful male colleagues who treated me with respect, who taught me what they knew. Tom Johnson was a mentor to me in the education department. He was a professor. He co-taught the foundations course with me. I had not taught that before, and to help me get a strong start before I took it over on my own. He also had a wonderful, encouraging spirit. He told me to approach each day in the office with a balance of joy and terror. There were other male colleagues who commiserated with me, who brainstormed with me about what we could do together with our departments jointly to make things better for our students. A few who came and apologized to me for something they had said in jest, or something that they had thought in retrospect may have been unwise or possibly even unkind to me. I'll never forget the first time a faculty member came in and he just said, I'm sorry I did this, I'm sorry I said that. He said, I respect you too much to let this go. Those times were just a breath of fresh air. Some were patriarchal in their treatment. On the other hand, when Dave Brandt came to be the first Bethel provost, he became my immediate supervisor. He expected me to come to meetings very well prepared, having done careful analysis, and he intensely questioned my decisions, but he also gave me great support and took time to really hear me. He did, however, change my Myers-Briggs to being much more analytical. He and I still chuckle about that. The coaches were a tough bunch for me since I took over athletics. Male coaches certainly did not expect or care to have a woman in charge of them. And I was indeed out of my league there. I had to learn quickly. I believe that working together to make improvements in athletics and using a search committee model, together we made excellent hires and added several sports to finally make the institution gender equitable by the time I left, 9 sports for each. Early on, I tried to meet with the male coaches one-on-one and listen to their complaints and their concerns. And eventually a few had the grace to tell me that I'd been right about some things. And eventually none of us could argue with the successes of Bethel Athletics as we'd added programs and added more staff, assistant coaches, better facilities, and better funding. Over my time at Bethel, I had 5 different male bosses. Dwayne Lind, who chaired the education department at the time and was a welcoming soul when I joined the group. Jim Bragg, who hired me for the alumni position, Dan Wearsome, who became my immediate boss in alumni, Doctors David Brandt and Jay Barnes as the provost, and President Brushhover. Each of them were supportive and expected a lot from me. I have an observation. The best clue for me then as to how a male colleague would respond to me in leadership was to see how he treated his wife and or his daughters. Some males became more supportive as their own daughters developed into strong girls and women. The student life staff was a good mix of males and females. I just immediately felt like I fit there and was accepted there. And most of our positions could be filled by either gender to serve students well. The team got used to me quickly as we had important work to do. We had to try to meet the needs of the students. We changed the titles Dean of Men and Dean of Women to Associate Deans to acknowledge the broader gender-free role that they played. We prayed and cried together and went, in some cases, to enormous lengths to help students. We developed a non-disciplinary policy so students could seek help without fear of punishment, and we became less and less likely to dismiss a student if they were willing to be held accountable. We often felt that keeping them at Bethel, where the place could still influence them, was preferable to dismissing them. Our staff consisted of males and females together, working on behalf of male and female students as if their lives depended on us. Sometimes they did. I do have some things that I could account for. One was just an increasing number of women faculty and administrators. Tricia Brownlee was personally, as one of the academic deans, very involved in hiring faculty and mentoring women in academia. This was continued by Deb Harless, and it paralleled efforts at the level of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. The CCU was also offering workshops for women in leadership at the Christian colleges. The second thing was, I think, having a preschool on campus made Bethel more attractive to women staff and benefited young families where either what could be an employee at Bethel, either the dad or the mom. But I think it helped us to bring more women to campus. Women's History Months were begun around 2000 with committees that planned ahead of time to bring events and information to the students' attention. The window right outside here in the Eastland room was dedicated to women in Bethel's history on more than one occasion. And you might want to check with Tom Vukolich to see some of the things that he put together to honor women in Bethel's history. I think another significant transition was the McKnight grant that we received to help us with our multicultural issues. We'd had several racial incidents on campus in the early 90s. There were people that felt very threatened, very unwelcomed here, that were people of color, both students and professors and administrators. It was a time of great hurt. And we had some situations where we even had to move people off campus just for their safety. And that became a very significant part of what student life worked with. And over time, many of us just continued to be involved with those efforts. And at one point, BARC came into being. It was the Bethel Anti-Racism and Reconciliation Commission. It was officially commissioned during a chapel, or I think it was around 2005, over which President Brushaber presided. He made it clear that Bethel intended to continue to combat racism. Another thing that I think made a difference, ethnographic research was done from about 1990 to 94, headed up by Dr. Harley Schreck, who was professor of anthropology and sociology, and by Dr. James Koch, who was professor of psychology and director of the counseling center. And I worked directly with them. It was a 3-person team, and we had some other young women who worked in the department, some as student workers like you, Ellie, that worked alongside of us. And that was, I think, a very good experience for them as well. Our goal was to better understand and be able then to better serve our students. Our research became part of campus-wide strategic planning goals at the time then. What we discovered in our research was shared with the community over time, and it did help to change some policies, some attitudes, and probably some functions in the time after the research, during and after the research. We also shared our research process of the ethnography with other schools in the ACSD, that would be the Christians in Student Development Group, thus contributing to the good of other campuses as well. Earlier than that, back in '94, we did some community life days to deal with some of the issues on campus. So that would be race, it would be alcohol, it would be some of the things we'd learned from the ethnographic research. And a particularly difficult and important assignment for me was to address the topic of date rape and sexual activity. That was in May of '94. It was one of our community life days set aside where the entire community was really urged, not required, but urged to attend. And the message that particular day was sadly needed in response to incidents on campus of date rape. So those things came up from time to time in a more of a crisis manner, but we tried to be dealing with them and setting up helpful policies and information along the way. All employees were required to attend trainings to combat sexual harassment and racial harassment. Although there was an undercurrent of resistance, the message was more clear, I think, than ever before. People such as myself were trained to deal with behaviors that were reported by those who experienced harassment, to seek truth and provide a just outcome. Also during my time here, athletics made consistent gains and arrived as close to gender equivalencies as Bethel had ever been. Just as I was leaving, we were able to add women's golf. I'm not sure where everything is now, but that was a huge effort. One of my personal transition moments was to realize that even though there were not women that were at my level or over me that could mentor me in that role, the gift of my women friends and colleagues became just so important and contributed so much good. We listened to each other. You've heard from some of these women, I know. Together we sorted out what was true and what needed the full institutional attention and change, or what just needed individual personal support. And one example for me was the day when I went home so discouraged by some of my mostly male colleagues who came against me in a situation. Tricia Brownlee, whom you've met, learned of it, and she actually came to my home to listen to me and care about me and advise me. So we kind of became co-mentors for each other in very good ways, and Tricia was certainly one of those for me. In my family, I was the first to have a master's degree and to be in a higher education role. I would say most importantly, my husband was a teacher. So I'm talking about my birth family. but I was blessed in my family, my nuclear family, and my kids and my husband, to have the full support of Steve and my children. Even though the job meant I didn't always give them my full attention. They were part of my decision making, part of my praying about these things as I took them, and they just came alongside of me very well. My wider family made not so very much note of my position at Bethel, although my mom was proud of me. And she was a little too Swedish to be able to say it, though. But mostly she prayed for me, and that's probably what I needed most. In church, I felt valued in both the churches that I attended during the time I worked at Bethel. During my time as alumni person, I was invited often to speak at different churches where I was holding alumni events. So that could have been all over the country. And then at some Christian schools for their chapels, for instance, when I was traveling on behalf of Bethel. Church responsibilities included teaching every age from preschool to adult classes in Sunday school settings or Wednesday night settings, and serving on pastoral search committees and on church boards. And my last official church position was vice chair, and during which time I also served for 6 of those months as a temporary chair. In terms of the academy and how my role was viewed there, was probably, since I was a faculty member here for a short time, I talked about being viewed positively by them for the most part. I think a more comparable thing was the value to the academy, or value to the administrative role that I had and how that was perceived outside of Bethel. I was honored to serve as the national president of the Association for Christians in Student Development. And during the last 6 years of my time at Bethel, I was selected to serve at the national level of the Christian College consortium, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the CCCU, as part of their SAPC, which is the Student Academic Program Commission. So I became part of a 6-member team that was assembled from faculty and administration from, at that point, it was about 100 plus schools in the CCCU. And we were gathered to evaluate the jointly offered semester study programs that the CCCU offered, both domestic programs and international programs. So I was responsible on that committee to vet the student development aspects of each of these study programs, but the total effort required the faculty members and the presidents and all of us that were on a team like that to look at the whole picture and make a judgment about it and provide helpful evaluation, we hoped, always. It was an honor for me, and it was really interesting, as the experiences visiting each program certainly expanded my horizons and probably led to my doing more international travel in my retirement than I would have. And I felt during that time, I know I had the full support of Jay, who was the provost at the time, and George Brushaber, the president, to represent Bethel in that way. In a society out there, I don't think my neighbors and friends really cared what I did for a living. Mostly just enjoyed being together. I was always a little hesitant to introduce myself as a vice president, and Steve would kind of say, you need to be accurate about what it is that you do. But it seemed a little prideful for me. So the good thing was when you get into retirement, nobody cares what you did for a living. It becomes less and less important to people. And instead, your common interests and your shared travels and your family updates and health-related conversations seem to be what matters more. I think that during the time that I became the vice president, there was a growing movement throughout the Christian colleges and others to have representation for student life at a higher level of administration. And so Bethel had been talking about that. And I know some people had spoken very directly about it back years before. But it was, I think, the right time. And yes, there were women that were coming into that role on their campuses as well. And that was a particularly wonderful group for me to be part of, because the men and the women in that group understood the commitments of that role, the complexity of that role, and we really were very supportive of each other and helpful to each other. People's expectations of what women could be and do perhaps entered into that, so that women weren't encouraged as much to continue in the highest levels of academic research and teaching. There were jobs that I think probably they thought that was more acceptable, that a woman could be, could care for the needs of students, could bring administrative experience, but it was new. It was a new role, but I think some of us at Welcome, some of us women welcomed it as a good fit for us, that it seemed to fit what our calling had been as we worked with people over the years. And I've just relished the fact that my calling was to college students. And even though I started that calling working with first graders, and I'm still trying to live that out as I know and love and work with people in my sphere, it was a good fit for me at the time. And I think it brought things out of my EQ that might not have come from my IQ level at that point, or my level of interest at that point, even though I had begun a doctorate. It's very interesting to think back about that. The culture seemed to be just right in the college for that role to become important, visible, and sought after by both men and women, as men and women were both sought after for the role. I think something that was interesting to me when I look back was a smaller percentage of students, I think, came from BGC churches, now known as Converge, over the years. And I chuckled, or we would chuckle sometimes and say, students come from BGC churches, or some have no idea that they came from BGC church and it didn't matter to them. But I think there was a good thing that was happening during the time I was here, where Bethel opened up a wider window theologically and a broader worldview. For a while, our admissions materials and other printed materials about Bethel had on it, begin with a question. And that was quite well received by faculty and others on campus, because it showed that it actually openly declared that here at Bethel, there was more openness to that, and that we allowed for differences of opinion, and that there was a lot to be explored out there. And I think it was just a good way to say, this is who we are now. And we were an established and solid academic institution that cares about academic freedom. It had been proved in the court system that we did care about that, and affirmed that that's where we came from. And I felt too, just from students' backgrounds, students that were Catholic and Lutheran and Methodist as examples, found Bethel to be a good home for them as well. And that was a good change also, because we had, I think, that wider, broader worldview, wider window. Well, my niece just graduated from here, and I was so delighted to hear and kind of share in her experience. And she's from Iowa, so we were her home base, living close to campus as we do. And I would hope for her and you, Ellie, and other students as they continue to feel that here they were respected, that they were encouraged, that they heard about calling and giftedness, and people tried to help them identify that. I would hope that they go forth with a really mature faith, that here they became more grounded than ever. I know say, make your faith your own. People say that all the time, but it's very real. They had to come face to face with, what do I do with this? And what does it mean for me? And does it have anything to do with my future? It has everything to do with their future. And I hope they always leave with that. And Dan Taylor, in one of his benedictions for students, said he hoped that they became ever more graceful and full of grace, full of wisdom, and full of grace, and full of that's not, I'll blow it. Full of mercy, but not more so than God himself, or something like that. Oh, don't quote me as quoting Dan, because it just doesn't work. But I hope that there is, in fact, in them a compassionate heart that cares, and that doesn't mean that accepts everything, but it loves, and that's what they bring into whatever part of the world they influence and abide in, and live out their faith. And strong academics, strong faith life, good friendships that last. There's some wonderful stories about friendships that last. I have a little bit of a summary statement, unless there are other questions, okay? Because, I wanted to be sure I got some things in. And you've been very patient with my stuttering and hearing you. Thank you. I think that this was wonderful just for me individually to think back, and I pulled out a lot of stuff from Bethel and then didn't look through it all because your questions didn't require me to, but I still have things that I'm submitting to the archives from time to time. We took a huge box of materials from the ethnographic research after Harley and I had looked through them again. That was probably almost a year ago, but I have other things that I want to do. But it's healthy for me to think back. And I think A summary, one of the summaries for me is that I'm kind of a woman surprised by God at several points in my life. I didn't grow up hearing about calling or gifting, nor did my family encourage me to catch any vision for myself beyond teaching. So when opportunities came to me, like supervising student teachers or teaching at St. Catherine's and then at Bethel, or the alumni director, or being the VP, I tended to very quickly decide that the timing was not right for me, or that I was not ready for such a thing or capable of doing that job. Steve, in those times of decision, never told me what he thought, but he listened to me in my decision making. He prayed with me for wisdom, supported me always. And by the way, there were job options that came my way that clearly were not right for me to do, not right for me to take. I was thankful to be able to discern those as well. To be among the women at Bethel who were, as some say, quote, pioneers in their areas of responsibility is actually very humbling. And I, along with those other women, as you've listened to them, we gracefully and gratefully did our jobs here, hoping that being the first to be in our roles, we would not, to quote Sandra Day O'Connor, be the last. Retirement has offered me the privilege of hindsight and remembering. So as I mentioned, my calling during those years I felt was with college students. And after I left here, the poor college student that I'd run into in the parking lot, I just had to interact with them. I think they wore a little sign, "Don't let Judy Moseman find me." So I just missed the interactions that I'd had with college students like you, Ellie. So I'm forever grateful for the privilege of being here and for what Bethel has meant to my family and to so many others. And I'm forever learning what it means to be faithful to my calling, even at age 80, as I am now, and to look at what's before me, trusting God for what's next. And that's even if I still won't think that the timing is right and that I'm ready. Amen to that.